This shape also is harmonically related to this shape. That means that this little dimension right here, if we zoom all the way out, look at that, is actually... Hey you guys, so today we're going to be talking about a very exciting topic for me, which is geometry in painting, and specifically the painter's secret geometry. Now, the idea behind geometry in painting is the laws of the universe make themselves manifest in the forms that we observe. So if you look at a sunflower, a human face, a tree, or whatever, what happens is that the actual form, meaning the physical characteristics of this thing, are coming through a lot of natural laws that are observable through science. Now, those natural laws will make themselves manifest in geometrical structures underneath the surface of what we observe. And when things follow that geometrical structure, it has a sense of balance, it has a sense of harmony, it has a sense of relationship with the very nature of the universe itself. And if those laws are that deep, and that they structure everything around us, then the human body and the human mind, which are also within this structure of the universe, are subjected to those laws as well. And it happens to be the case as well that our perceptions themselves are built on these same laws. So the only way we can actually visually perceive something is using something akin to natural law. Meaning that if your painting doesn't have a sense of proportion, it has a sense of geometrical relationships, that it's going to be less intelligible by the human mind. Now, geometry in painting has been something that's been very shrouded in mystery and skepticism for a long time. I've been skeptical of it, especially before I got back into architecture. But I realized over time that if the majority of what architects are doing during their time when they're trying to make buildings look good is adding proportional and geometric harmonies, then there has to be something to geometric harmony in the human unconscious, and it has to also relate to other visual arts like painting. So going on that assumption, you start reading books like The Painter's Secret Geometry, you start reading Michael Jacobs and Jay Hambidge, and you start looking at the geometry behind the visual experiences that we're having, and it starts becoming pretty undeniable that there's something there. So today I'm not going to be taking a very dogmatic view, it's not going to be very prescriptive, but I'm going to try to just open your mind and show you at least the steelman argument for why geometry tends to exist in paintings, philosophically, and then also how to practically put in your paintings. So it's going to be exciting. Let's get right into it. So if you watched my last video on classical architecture, you would have heard me talk about Palladio. Now, Andrea Palladio was a Renaissance architect, and he was very popular for basically intuiting a lot of the plans that he saw in old ancient Rome and coming up with what the structures would actually look like using just logic and reason. And then he published a bunch of the plates of these constructed old architectural buildings based on just the ruins, and sometimes just based on like column fragments and stuff. But he published a thing called the 4 Books of Architecture, which was a reference name-wise to the 10 Books of Architecture. But the thing in that entire series that, in my opinion, is one of the most pivotal is his proportional analysis and his suggestion that you should be using proportions, and it's called his proportional room harmonies, right? And there's also a relationship to musical harmonies, and there's a bunch of different philosophy there. But the simple idea here is that anything that's, quote, proportionate is really just anything that has a relationship. And you'll realize more as you study art that what makes art look better and better and better is subsequent relationships between things. That's what makes rhythm look beautiful. That will make something look flowy is a relationship of curvature. So you'll see that there's this giant, simple gestural curve, right? And in art class, you're taught that you use gestural curves to draw. But it's not just to draw. It's kind of to add a geometrical harmony to the figure that you're creating. Now, if we go less of a fluid kind of organic way, and we think about things more in terms of mathematical harmonies and curves and these sort of things, you'll start seeing that there's actually a pretty rigid mathematical approach that you can take to painting that can add a lot of mathematical harmony to your paintings, and it doesn't involve a lot of calculation. It's just visual geometry, and we're going to be going into that. But when we're talking about relationship, the most basic types of relationships is static relationships. So J. Hambidge talks about proportions, and he says that historically there's two things. There's static symmetry, right? And then there's dynamic symmetry. Now, by symmetry, he's loosely using the Greek word or something, and that means basically just harmony relationship. So symmetry doesn't necessarily mean bilateral symmetry like we think about it. But static symmetry, as he defines it, is what a lot of the Palladian room harmonies are, right? So the square is a proportionate shape. Why? Because it has a relationship from its side to its other side, right? It's a 1-to-1. So in some senses, it's kind of perfect in a weird way, right? It's related to itself. It's the same thing with the circle, right? Everything on a circle is equidistant from a center, so it all has a relationship to this one center, which makes it have a sense of harmony because it has a sense of relationship. Now, in physical structures, the reason why relationships are important is because we live in a dynamic universe. Energy has to flow from some places to others. Rivers flow down, blood flows around the body, these sort of things. And the only way that things can actually flow and energies can be balanced is through connections and relationships, right? Veins are basically relationships between different parts of the body. And this has to do with formalism as well. So when you don't implement a lot of relationships in your painting, it feels fragmented and it's going to look aesthetically worse. So if we take this to the most simple of ways, in Palladio's case, right, we have a square and a third. That's a proportional shape. Now, the idea isn't that if you just have this square by itself, that someone's going to look at that square and be like, wow, that's a very beautiful square. There might be a little bit of that. You know, some squares might look better than other ones, or rectangles might look better than other ones. But the idea is that when you have a proportional shape, once you subdivide that shape, what you end up getting is more and more proportional harmony, right? So it's not just the overall shape, it's the fact that you can continue to create more order. Now, this is something very important in geometry, is that order creates more order. And chaos creates more chaos. So these things are either going to exponentially work for you or they're going to exponentially not work for you. So if we just look at a simple example, and I'll go more into this once I teach you how to actually read geometry, because it is something that you have to learn to read, learn to see. It's an old way of seeing, right, as Jonathan Hale would say. But if we look at this, the whole composition is essentially a 3x4, right? 30x40, whatever. That's the proportion of the length to the width. Now, what that means is that we can, if we start subdividing it into 4 sections right here, right, then we can subdivide this in half. Now, this section right here is a proportionate shape, right? Because when we started with these relationships, as soon as we subdivide down the relationships, we get more relationships. And then if we continue to subdivide that, we're going to find that there's a lot of geometrical harmony within these subdivisions, right? But if we started off with a very weird proportion as the overall bounding box, it becomes a lot more difficult to add levels of scale of proportional relationship. Now you can see that, you know, sure, these shapes don't look good by themselves, but when you start with a good shape, you can create more and more relationship, more and more harmony. So these are Palladios. So you have square and a third, you have square and a half, you have double square, you have square and 2/3, and then you have square, and then you have this very special one, right? Now this one is a little bit different. This is not static symmetry. This is what Hambidge would describe as dynamic symmetry. So this particular one is 1 to the square root of 2. Now the square root of 2, don't think about it too much in terms of math, just think about it in terms of the diagonal of a square becomes the length of this rectangle, right? Now, the reason why this is important is because once you subdivide this rectangle, this is root 2 right here, and this is from Michael Jacobs' book, which is quite wonderful, The Art of Composition, Simple Application to Dynamic Symmetry. Now, he talks a little bit too much about geometry. Geometry is just one part of painting, you guys. Like, it should be focused on, it should be understood, but values, balances of masses and gesture, all these other things, that's really foundational. You need to have that right. And I think Michael Jacobs kind of puts too much emphasis on geometry, and a lot of his compositions end up sucking, frankly. But that doesn't mean his theory isn't right, you know, in isolation. So if we look at this root 2, the special thing about this kind of shape is that when you cross the diagonals and then you cross the semi-diagonals, these semi-diagonals hit at a perpendicular. Now what that means is that this shape is self-similar at multiple different scales. What does that mean, Chad? Right? It means that no matter how you subdivide this thing, if you subdivide it into nine parts like we have here, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, so now we have 9 sections. All of these sections are the exact same proportion as the overall bounding box. So that means that you've divided all of these different sections of the painting in harmonic areas with harmonic proportions, so it's self-referential, which ends up looking quite beautiful. Now, I'm going to go into later how we're going to apply that to painting, but just keep that in the back of your mind right now. It's a lot to take in, but once you understand it, it makes a lot of sense. So just in a basic sense, let's start talking about how to read geometry in paintings. So if you have 2 diagonals, right? Let's just take this rectangle here. 2 diagonals, as many of you should know from studying perspective, split something into half, right? Now, the point where they intersect is halfway. What does that mean? That's basically visual math, right? So we're taking lines, and where they intersect, that's visual math. So if we continue that idea, we can see that we can read a shape just using these lines in other ways, right? So if we put this line down the middle, now we've split it in half. Now, if we split that half into a diagonal, and where that it's called semi-diagonal, hits the overall diagonal, that's a third, right? Now you guys can check this on Rhino or AutoCAD, whatever's, but just trust me, this is this is true. So you split this into thirds, right? And then if we take this, that also splits it into thirds, right? Now if we do it, now you also notice that because this original shape is a 3x4, because we've split this side into half, now it splits that into fourths, right? So where the semi-diagonals hit the diagonal, that's a third. Where the semi-diagonals hit each other, that's a fourth. And you can continue this on and on. There's this book called The Diagram. It's published by Wooden Books. Great. It talks about how to split into fifths, sixths, ninths, split to your heart's content, right? But the idea here is that diagonals are not arbitrary, right? And they're not just lines of forces. Where they intersect, that's very important. So when we're looking at something like this, where these intersect is important, where those intersect is important, right? If we look at it even further, like over here, where now you guys should be able to read this, right? I've split this into this shape right here. Now, if we split this into half, we have this. Now again, why does this look good? Why is this important? Because you're making the different parts of the composition relate to each other. This part relates to that part in size, right? Because they both fit into each other. Now, if I divide this into 3, we have this part. Now, what does that mean, right? It means that if we do this into another 3, it fits into this shape. But guess what? Because this shape also is harmonically related to this shape, that means that this little dimension right here, if we zoom all the way out, if you think about it, is actually related to the whole. Now in architecture, especially when you're dealing with multiple levels of scale, which isn't generally as applicable in painting because you're working at one viewing point, one distance from the painting, it's very important to have a harmony at every single level of scale, meaning that the smallest mullion molding in your window is related to the biggest mass of your entire building. But the same thing happens with painting, because think about it. In painting, you're building, in a certain sense, right? You're creating a physical object. When you're creating a physical object and it doesn't obey the laws of the universe, guess what? It's not going to look right, because our mind, the only way it could perceive is based on those universal laws. So you can't understand it unconsciously unless it mimics those natural laws. And as things grow in nature, things are always harmonically related because they couldn't exist otherwise. They couldn't exist in the universe without that sense of harmonic relationship, right? So anyways, now we kind of are starting to understand what static symmetry is. And this is called part symmetry. This is similar in architecture. You use the column diameter, and the column diameter basically decides all the proportions of the rest of the structure. Series over in Europe, they have much more proportion paper sizes because this is actually a standard piece of paper. And the way that the A4 series, A2, whatever works, is that you can basically keep subdividing, and these are all standardized paper sizes. So like in America, we have 9.5 by 11, and like these really ugly proportions that suck. But luckily it's been standardized in a more proportional sense over there. So everything has a better sense of geometric harmony, right? So with the difference between dynamic symmetry and static symmetry is that static symmetry is always referring to that module, right? That original ratio. So for the square and a third, it's referring to this original square ratio. Technically, it's just a subdivision of that original ratio. It could be any sort of module. You find this in furniture design too. A lot of like Varnum and other people talk about this. But dynamic symmetry is a little bit different, but it's sort of the same thing as well. Because dynamic symmetry, when you're subdividing things, not only are you using basically static symmetry, right? Because we've just split this shape into two, so that relates to that, right? Those are the same size. But what you've also done is that you've created self-similarity, right? So you have self-similarity and you have a sort of static symmetry relationship. You have a part relationship, part to whole. Things fit into each other. So you'll see that, this is why people like Hambidge, who kind of didn't invent it, but he popularized the idea of it, systematized it. That's why he said it was better. He advocated for it over static symmetry. My personal opinion, you can use both. Like, people intuitively use both. People naturally find both appealing. A lot of, all of Renaissance architecture pretty much was not the J. Hambidge version of dynamic symmetry. A lot of it was just static symmetry, and painters have used static symmetry for, who knows how long. There could be an argument that dynamic symmetry is better, but let's just go for static for right now. So you'll see that, and I just want to show you guys that this is not just a painting thing. This isn't just an architecture thing. This is actually something that's pervasive in all fields of design. So if you look at just for an example, the 458 Ferrari, right? Beautiful car. Obviously the designers know what they're doing, because it's very expensive and whatnot. But you'll see that in almost every single car that's designed well, there's a relationship with the wheels, right? Now, if you look at this, if you take the wheel diameter, then there's 3 wheels that fit between these wheels, right? Is that just random chance? No, okay? That's geometric harmony. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean, right? That means that the wheel size has a relationship to the rest of the car body, right? So everything has a sort of relationship. Similar sort of thing, I'm sure, in the speciality. I don't know if they're using dynamic symmetry. Probably not. More niche idea. But if you take this overall dimension and you start subdividing it, you would find a lot of interesting ratios. You'd start seeing things line up, because this is just a pervasive way that people design, product designers and car designers. Now, it's also more pervasive than that, because it actually has to do with the human face as well, right? So if we zoom in on Egyptian Queen by Frank Frazetta, the eyes, right, one eye, fits into a proportional scheme as well. There's one eye spacing between the eyes. Now, that's not just Frazetta's riff on it, right? That's actually pretty much a law, right, for all human faces. And you can notice, look at your face in the mirror right now. Pause the video, go in the mirror. Measure the space between your eyes. There's a relationship between the eyes, right? Now, a lot of theorists, a lot of architectural theorists try to say that we do these things like put a proportion between all these different things because it anthropomorphizes what we're designing, right? But I think that's a little bit misleading. Sure, we're anthropomorphizing it in a weird way, but we're not aiming to make it look more human. We're aiming to make it look more ordered insofar as the human body reflects that sort of universal order that we find, right? So it's a little bit of a way of reframing it, but that's the reason why we shouldn't be designing paintings that are reminiscent of a human face. We shouldn't be designing buildings that are reminiscent of a human face because it's a human face. We're trying to just look at why the human body looks the way it does, right? And then use those abstract laws, those geometric laws, those laws of balance and whatnot, and then imbue them into our paintings. And when you do that, somebody will look at your painting and just feel at home, feel a sense of rest, feel a sense of pleasure, right? So that's what we're trying to do as artists, is that we're trying to enrich people's lives by reminding them of a universal order that exists around us, and it gives people meaning, and it gives people a sense of calmness in their psyche and their soul. It's necessary for us to function as human beings, to have a relationship with reality, right? And that's the role of the artist. We're creating a physical thing. So if you create it in a sense of disorder, it's going to elicit anxiety from the person because it shouldn't exist, right? So all those things are wrapped in there. Very important. Now, this is nothing new with geometry, right? So if you go into what is it? Bulu or whatever? I don't know. Somebody in the comments told me how to pronounce that. But if you look further in his book, he does a lot of things where it's the same sort of ideas you'll find a lot. Now, this might look new with the way that he's arranging these, squares within this circle, but what is this really, right? Do you guys know? It's our friend the root 2, right? Why? Well, if you think about what I showed you earlier on how to create it, you grab this, and then this is the center point, and you knock it down, then you can see how you can start adding root 2 relationships within a circular composition, right? So what he's done here is that you can diminish, what you've done is that you've diminished this circle by a factor of root 2. When you cross a square with an arc from its center, you've basically cut it into a root 2, right? You can do it either way you want, but this is a root 2, right? So you're adding in another one of these root 2 relationships, which, remember, the reason why the root 2 looks good is because you can infinitely subdivide it. Now, we've seen that we subdivide that into 9 parts. Think about it. You can subdivide this again into 9 because it's the exact same overall shape. It's the same proportion. So that you're creating relationships at very deep nested levels, which is how things have to grow in reality to exist. Think about cellular organisms, right? You start out with a very small scale, and then you have to develop into a very large scale, and that happens with everything that is alive. And it wouldn't make any practical sense to expand in an erratic way, in a sort of weird, non mathematical way, because it's easier to code an organism DNA wise with very simple ratios of expansion, right? So a lot of this math, a lot of the geometry, a lot of this stuff is kind of occulty. It's kind of suspicious. It's you can be skeptical of it, but if you really think about what it is, it's just the universe has laws. Who is surprised by that? And those laws manifest themselves into the form of the objects we perceive, and our perceptions themselves are also related to those laws. So it's like, is this really something we should be skeptical of? Like, it makes a lot of sense. Now, if we start looking at other painters, right? So Sargent, for example, he did train at the Beaux-Arts school. The Beaux-Arts school, a lot of these ideas of proportional harmonies are floating around because you're still in a sort of golden age of architecture, a golden age of art, where they're still understanding the human psyche in a classical manner, in a way of understanding geometry. They're composing their images in a way that I advocate for, at least, right? And there's a lot of people in the Beaux-Arts school, like, for example, Gaudet, who was an architectural theorist. He wrote Elements of Theories of Architecture. He was skeptical he still had the Enlightenment sort of skepticism of these musical harmonies and these ways of relating the ear to the eye, right? The way that the ear works in hearing music, perfect fifths and such, which is the same sort of mathematical harmonies that I'm talking about. Does that relate to the way that the eye works, right? That was the original musical theory that Palladio popularized in many ways in architecture, right? But is that true? Well, Gaudet was kind of skeptical, but a lot of those ideas were still floating around. That's the reason why he was advocating for it, and Sargent was around those kind of people. So, did Sargent intentionally use geometry within his paintings? Maybe, I'm not really sure. But if we can actually accept, which I think it's a pretty reasonable proposition, that geometry is something that isn't just something that we consciously employ, but it's something that unconsciously is drawing us. If we're looking at her painting and we're reacting to it, right? If you're Sargent and you're trying to move these sitters around, right? She's standing a little to the left, and your subconscious says, hey, just scoot her over a little bit, right? You'll see this all the time with photographers and painters, that they're like, hey, can you move a little bit to the left? Can you do this? Turn your hand, blah, blah, blah. Now, some of that's conscious. A lot of that's unconscious, though, right? So no matter how you spin it, was Sargent intentionally doing it? I don't know. Probably not. Maybe. I don't know, right? But, will it exist in his paintings? Can we find a structure that maybe unconsciously he was reacting to? Almost definitely. And I'll find this with my paintings too, that when I originally started, obviously I knew nothing of geometry. I didn't even know that the bounding box of a painting had a relationship or influence on the way that you're designing the rest of the painting. I didn't know that the ratio was important, right? Who's ever heard of harmonic ratios in painting dimensions? It's just never talked about. It's just really never talked about, especially on YouTube and stuff, and that's why I'm making this video. But as you go further into it, I studied and did proportional analyses of my old paintings, and I was using proportional harmonies, and it was totally unconscious, right? And one of the reasons why was because I would take dozens of photos, and this is the way a lot of artists work, right? Or if you're working from life, you do dozens of arrangements, dozens of different poses and stuff, right? And you're looking for one that sticks, Well, why do some stick? Why do some suck? Why does everybody almost agree almost entirely, right? There's a little bit of discrepancy, obviously, with some subjectivity, but most people agree when a photo sucks. Most people agree when a photo's pretty good looking, right? Why? Right? Is that not obvious? I mean, I don't think it's self-evident at all, right? But if you start studying why, if you go into that phenomena, then you start finding a bunch of really weird stuff. And geometry is one of those things, right? Geometry is definitely one of those things. Now, if we start looking at Sargent's paintings, right? And we take, basically what I've done here, it looks complicated, but it's really not too complicated. We just take a circle all the way to the corner's edge. You can see that you can draw an arc here, right? Now, this arc, if we think about curves in terms of forces, right? Why do curves exist in nature? Why do they exist in nature? Well, it's because usually you have a line, which is some form of relationship between things, right? You have 2 points, A and B, and A and B want to be connected, right? So this could be you have a trunk and this is the branch, right? This could be you have the shoulder socket and this is the hand, you don't know, right? But you have a line, right? Now, when a force happens, which happens all the time, could be wind, could be a physical force, punching somebody, right? Animals lunging at you, there's some soil, there's some weird thing in the soil, so the branch has to kind of move around, right? Move around this stiff soil or something, right? So that the roots can get enough nutrients, they can get to the proper parts of the soil, whatever, right? So there's a force. What does that force do? It pushes. Now, what happens to a line when it gets pushed? It curves, right? So there's this inherent association of curves and force. So what does that mean for painters, right? What does that mean for architects? So the thing is that if there's a stairway in front of you and it goes like this, you're going to feel, and this is you, right? You're going to feel pushed, bam, away. And you'll see this in Michelangelo's staircase, his triple staircase. Nobody goes up the middle. Why? Right? It's because it's pushing you out. So what does that mean for this painting, right? That means that from every corner, which corners exist in physical organisms all the time, there's some sort of force, right? Now, if we can think about the fact that in a lot of structural organisms that there's some force coming from every corner, right? Then the lines, the intersections, is where these forces balance, okay? So if you take an arc, which we've done here, and you arc it from every corner, where these intersect, if you nest another little square in here, you've now created a balanced square within this square. Now, another cool thing is that if you look at areas, and you can do this in Rhino, right, or in AutoCAD or whatever you want, or you can just actually do it with math, pencil and paper, right? But if you look at the area of this to this, it's a 1-to-1 area. So you've diminished this square by a 1-to-1 area, right? What does that mean? It means there's more mathematical harmony, right? So it's more than just lengths. It's more than just that. It's volumes, right? It's volumes, it's areas, it's all these different things. And when you create a sense of area relationship, that's when you're really getting into the meat and potatoes of this geometric harmony stuff, which exists all over the place. If you look at old treatises of how to balance columns and colonnades and stuff, you're looking at making the visual areas balance, right? The supports and the supported have to be in an equal amount. And that's what gives old porticos a sense of beauty, is that the columns are the same visual area as the entablature, right? And the pediment on top of it as well is always included in that analysis. So same thing in the Arc de Triomphe in France and all these other sort of things. Okay, so we've nested the square, and we know that there's an area-based relationship. Don't forget, we've created all these root 2s too, so these are all root 2s, right? So we start subdividing that into more and more and more. We can find that there's honestly kind of an interesting relationship at multiple different scales. Now, I'm not going to push this analysis too hard because Sargent, obviously there's a finite amount of order you can put in a pre-composed composition. What I mean by that is that her dress and stuff, has a certain geometry to it already. Can he make it clip this way, so that it hits this corner exactly? Maybe, maybe not. It's also better not to religiously be tied to these geometries, because the fact is, sure, these geometries exist in nature, but there's a lot of variance, and that's why you never find, the golden ratio is a big idea in painting and in architecture and stuff, but you never really find it precisely in nature, right? You find remnants, you find echoes of it, because it does exist as a pattern, but once something's contextualized, once a genome, once the DNA is actually contextualized, it has to it has to respond to physical forces. So that platonic, perfect mathematical harmony is always going to be sort of changed, obscured, altered in some sort of way that it's still reminiscent of that math, but it's a little bit different. It's a little bit off. So you'll find a lot of art and architecture, frankly, where, is her cheek right on the halfway? Pretty much, but her ear is a little bit out, right? And then we have this corner, that goes a little bit beyond the thing. So when you find discrepancies, it shouldn't be something that's disproves the rule. It should just prove that art's a very complicated thing, and you can't look at it in a very mechanistic way because you lose the whole understanding of that, right? Because geometry is one thing, but guess what? Geometry is influenced by values and colors too, and we can get into that, right? But if we take a pure view of geometry, we're kind of missing the bigger picture, but it's also still part of that bigger picture. So, interestingly enough, this curve, kind of weird, that's regulated by this curve, which is kind of interesting, right? So you not only have this area where you place this figure pretty much on the middle, right? But you also have these curves which regulate the dress. That's pretty weird, right? That's kind of strange. And then you find an echo of that curve in another one, right? And you'll see this in a lot of Baroque paintings where they echo diagonals across the painting. So you find that curve regulates. That's kind of weird, right? There's a lot of interesting things that start showing up. And who knows if this was the geometry he was making. This is just one that I was throwing out to see what would work. Now, if you look at this painting, for example, too, this is a little bit more speculative in my opinion because if you look at the painting dimensions in centimeters, it's slightly off the golden ratio. So this is the golden ratio right here. And this is also one of the most talked about. Everybody loves the golden ratio. And it is because it's pretty mathematically amazing. If you really get into it. But basically the idea is if you have a square and you take the semi-diagonal of that square and then you arc it down, that's how you get the golden ratio. And then you just basically put a square, and then the leftover amounts are all golden ratio squares as well. So this is a golden ratio, right? This is a golden ratio. This is a golden ratio. Now you see this all over the Parthenon. It's literally all over the Parthenon, right? The metopes are square. The triglyphs are golden ratio square. So it has its roots in ancient architecture and stuff, and it has our roots in our psychology. And if you look at the human face, it's literally all over the human face. I'd highly suggest anybody to do like an AutoCAD understanding and proportional analysis of the human face. It's literally all over the human face, everywhere, right? And it makes sense too. It's not like this is some mystical thing. Like it's just a natural law of the universe that is reoccurring. And if you think about a balance of all numbers, some numbers, right, in low amounts are bounded to be related to other numbers in more of a relationship than other numbers tend to be related to in other numbers. So finding reoccurrences and patterns in nature, is that really surprising to anybody that nature copies good solutions, right? Is that really surprising? Are we supposed to be skeptical of that? Like, it makes a lot of sense to me. But if you think about it, so it's kind of interesting. He has if you draw a diagonal from this corner, that's not perfect, obviously, but it cuts. It's interesting that the horizon line's about halfway here, but it raises up around here, and that's, kind of regulated. This is called the section. Plato called it the section, right? Super important. But that's right there. You can see, there's kind of an interesting thing. Like, this woman is pretty much right on that square. So you'll see that even Sargent, and Sargent is one of those ones where he's not evidently using it. It's kind of just echoed in his paintings. Let's get finally to Frazetta, right? So I've given you a lot of the background to understand what geometry is, how it works, the basics of reading geometry, halfway, semi-diagonals, this sort of thing. So if we look at Frazetta's painting, these large circles aren't just to look cool. I'm basically trying to tell you that this is a 3x4. So if you think about it, if you draw a square ray here, what that square does is that it tells you whether the side length and the long length have a relationship, right? So if we take the square and we take the circle and we split that circle into 3 parts, then we have a 4th part left over. So now we know that this is 3 and that is 4, right? Now if we go into this further and we split it into 2, now what this relationship is, so now we have a 2 to 3 as a subdivided rectangle. So originally we start with a 4x3, and then if we half that, you get 2x3, right? Now we end up with a 2x3. Now this is what I was trying to say with order creates more order. when you subdivide an ordered rectangle, you get more order. And then if we continue to subdivide it, as we've already discussed, you start finding a lot of interesting analyses. So how do you actually employ these relationships, these geometries, right? It's really kind of cool to see how Frazetta does it. So he has architecture, which is one of the easiest things to proportion because you're not dealing with complex curves. So it might be evident. I think it goes without saying how to proportion architecture, right? You find that third mark, that's the top of this. It's basically whatever you want, right? It could also be the side of it. It could also be the middle of it. You know what I mean? As long as it's side, middle, or something like that, you're going to end up with proportional relationships just with the way that the math works out. And then this is halfway. Now, but we see, this whole column is round, right? So at what point will it hit a half point? Well, it's not really important because what is important is that it's generally right there in the half point, right? And the idea is that out of perspective, this has some sort of relationship as well. So if we look further into the painting, you'll see how he's actually pretty geniusly dividing up the space. So this column, which seems like it doesn't really have a relationship, actually does. There's a leftover third space here, and that's what these three circles represent. Is that you've leftover, and then you have that occupies that to the halfway point. This circle is pretty much split in half as well, right? Especially considering her line right there, splitting it about in half. Now the thing is too with geometry, because you have so many different things happening in a painting, like for example, how do you know to take that versus that, right? Well, the idea is that the general mass, how does it average out? Averages around that half circle, right? Now if it was like this, if it averaged out around there, not really that good looking. So equal proportions, very low numbers are always going to look better than 11/17 or something very strange like that. You don't want to go for those, are ugly proportions. You want to go for low number, and that's why Palladio's harmonies work so well. They're very low, they're very simple, right? And that's why flowers, for example, right? Do they have petals of a bajillion amount, right? No, they have like 5 petals, or they have 4, right? Or 3 rather. It's usually odd numbers, right? Because you need a center. But I hope that you guys can begin to see how you would analyze things using proportions. There's so much to this, by the way. Beyond painting, it really gets into the nature of the universe, gets into very interesting questions of human psychology and everything. But if you guys enjoyed this, leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think. This is something I've been ruminating on for a little while. I'm curious to hear what you guys are interested in learning next. Please leave some comments down below. So I hope you guys have a great day and go make something beautiful. I'll see you later.